All right, so let's get into it because we're kind of running late. And these are just one of my disclosures. I serve as a volunteer scientific advisor for the Institute for Advancement of Food and Nutrition Sciences, specifically the caffeine working group. Again, this is voluntary. It's been a great experience, actually. And so today's talk, there'll be a number of areas I'll be covering. Specifically, I'll briefly discuss caffeine consumption patterns in the US, kind of a rapid review of caffeine and health, the US guidelines that are informed by some of the research done in caffeine and health. Then I'll focus a little bit more on the pharmacology of caffeine and more advanced Omic approaches to caffeine and health research. So just to recap, the major sources of caffeine in our diet, at least in the US population, comes from coffee, tea, cola, and some of these energy drinks. Coffee and tea are natural sources of caffeine that have been around for hundreds of years. Colas and energy drinks are artificial. But interestingly, cola wasn't always an artificial source of caffeine. And when it was first developed by a pharmacist in 1886 in Atlanta, Georgia, the key ingredients of Coca-Cola were actually natural. The Coca-Cola contained the coca leaf, which contains, my mic's here. Can people hear me okay? Coca was came from the fresh leaves and actually contained cocaine at the time. And cola nut was also a natural source of caffeine. But in 1903, because people realized, okay, having cocaine in our Coca-Cola supply probably isn't a good idea for public health. So they actually changed instead of using fresh coca leaves, they would use spent leaves. So that removed cocaine from Coca-Cola. And in 1904, instead of using cola nut, they started synthesizing caffeine, and so it was an artificial. Energy drinks, many of us, when we think about energy drinks, we think of Red Bull, but energy drinks are actually developed many more years before that, in 1949 by a businessman in Chicago, Illinois. The first one was Dr. Enough, and it was actually a combination of caffeine and B vitamins. Following that, there were a number of iterations of these energy drinks, and not until 1984 was the launch of Red Bull, and that's when the energy drink era kind of really launched. Now, but these are all our important or key sources of caffeine in our diet. There are clearly other differences across these different sources. Coffee and tea being natural, they are naturally energy-free or calorie-free, which is important. So they contain natural sources of other compounds. Coffee is a special contributor of chlorogenic acid, which is a unique polyphenol. And it's a major contributor of this polyphenol in the diet. Tea is unique in that it contains these theoflavins and other tannins. And again, while they both contain caffeine, there's clearly different characteristics in terms of what else they contain. Colas and energy drinks, completely artificial, and they've contained flavorings and other ingredients that often remain mysteries. And while this is somewhat dated, it provides a pretty good insight into the distribution of the different types of caffeine in the diet. Again, just highlighting the fact that coffee is the major source of caffeine for the total population, particularly for the older individuals. But we can see that in younger individuals, other sources of caffeine are predominant sources. But again, the caffeine intake for younger individuals is generally much lower. Since 2012, the amount of caffeine has increased over time. Here's a more up-to-date look at adults' consumption. And here we compare the national intake at around 2007 versus 2017. While I don't actually show you the breakdown of caffeine, I'd just like to focus specifically on coffee and tea. Since between these two time points, it has significantly increased. And what I also find interesting is that, as I mentioned, coffee and tea are naturally calorie-free. But when we look at the distribution of beverages and their contribution to total energy intake, we actually see that coffee and tea actually provide energy. So that just tells us that a lot of people are probably adding things to their coffee and tea, so sugars and milk. And the increase is actually consistent with the increase in coffee and tea consumption. Interestingly, the remarkable contribution that these beverages play in daily energy intake is more pronounced in the younger individuals. Here we see that around, obviously, as I mentioned, coffee and tea are really great, aren't extremely popular in a younger group, but between these two time points, the coffee and tea intake are generally about the same. But when we look at their contribution to overall energy intake, we see that if we look at the red, that's where the contribution of coffee and tea are energy. There's actually quite significant difference. So while the coffee and tea consumption overall hasn't changed, how people are preparing their coffee and tea is different, especially for a younger group. We know that high energy leads to obesity, and that might be an important contributor to obesity if these beverages are important sources in the diet. Here's just kind of the increasing trends in energy drink consumption. And this is most notable. It's kind of funky with the adolescents and middle-aged groups, but for young individuals, we see this natural increase. Mind you, the absolute, so these are on our y-axis, we have the percentage of prevalence. So only at most, there's like 5% people consuming the energy drinks, but it's actually the increasing in trend, which gets some people a little concerned, especially when there have been some cases of issues regarding energy drink consumption. I'll briefly touch on that in subsequent slides. So when looking at the role that coffee and caffeine or other sources of caffeine play in our diet, there are a number of ways we can look at studies. We can conduct animal studies, observational studies, and intervention studies. Observational studies have been probably contributed the most to our insight on coffee and health and caffeine and health. And there have been many studies. And there's also been intervention studies, but these have predominantly been focused on biomarkers of disease. And what I'll be doing today is actually focusing on the meta-analysis, which seek to combine all the available data, because there have been a lot of observational studies, and so the meta-analysis combines them all, in addition to systematic reviews, which incorporate potential mechanisms linking coffee or caffeine to health. So the next 4 or 5 slides, I'll be doing like a rapid fire on the relationship between coffee and health. And so this slide shows you the epidemiological evidence supporting the benefits of caffeine and health. Again, I just also like to focus that most of these studies are predominantly based on adults. And the first kind of group of diseases show a significant beneficial effect of coffee on these diseases. Parkinson's disease is especially robust in that consumption of coffee and caffeine reduces risk. And these columns just indicate what is it specifically that's related to its benefits. We know that coffee and tea are major contributors, so they're highly correlated with the caffeine intake. So sometimes with nutrition studies, it's very hard to tease apart the effect of coffee tea from caffeine. So when I have these double check marks, indicates that there's pretty good evidence based on epidemiological data and also some animal work suggesting that it's the caffeine component that's driving the beneficial impact that dietary caffeine has on these particular endpoints. Other diseases such as chronic kidney disease, depression, and prostate cancer, it's not clear whether it's caffeine per se or is it coffee and tea per se, if there's other components of coffee and tea, because as I mentioned, coffee and tea are rich sources of other potentially good things. Here we have another slot of data showing benefits of caffeine in adults. And here, these are predominantly the cardiovascular disease endpoints. And generally, they support the role of caffeine being beneficial, but it's probably the natural sources of coffee. Another very strong and robust finding is the beneficial role that caffeine and coffee specifically has in type 2 diabetes. And it's more specific to coffee because they've shown that decaf coffee has about the same effect sizes in terms of risk for type 2 diabetes. And so that would suggest that it's not caffeine per se, but coffee in general. And oftentimes, even with say heart disease, and often they've shown that it's more of the best benefits is probably at the moderate intakes. It's possible that maybe higher consumption of coffee or caffeine that's when potentially adverse effects might impact the heart. But about moderate intakes, as obviously the definition of moderate intake kind of varies, and I'll be discussing that as well. And here's the only slide suggesting showing epidemiological evidence supporting risks, and these are predominantly based on the infant or pregnancy outcomes for mothers or whoever's pregnant. And these are related to pregnancy loss, low birth weight, and birth defects. And these are consistently showing that it's predominantly caffeine that might have these impacts. There's a lot of limitations on the observational studies for pregnancy. One key compounder is that when women become pregnant, a good pregnancy, a sign of a good pregnancy is nausea, and coffee on an empty stomach can be nauseous for some women. So they might cut back on coffee, and that might artificially present this kind of association suggesting that cutting back on coffee and caffeine is probably good for the child. So there's a little bit of confounding there. Randomized control trials, as mentioned, has not really looked at disease outcomes, but have looked at biomarkers and generally show that, at least for coffee, it's been shown to increase cholesterol levels. But the key caveat there is that it's the unfiltered coffee. Most of the coffee that's brewed in the US is filtered, but the unfiltered coffee contains these lipids and the diterpenes, and they've been shown consistently to increase cholesterol. So if you're worried about your cholesterol levels and you're currently drinking unfiltered coffee, a little quick hack would be to add a filter. I think some of the French presses and some of the espressos are not filtered coffee, so that might be something to be concerned about, especially with some of these kind of gourmet coffees. They're often not filtered. Again, there's also significant or strong evidence suggesting that caffeine might interfere with sleeping time and quality. There's significant data suggesting that caffeine might reduce weight or help with weight management over time. And in terms of athletics and endurance, consistently caffeine has been shown to have at least acute beneficial effects on endurance and physical activity. And blood pressure, caffeine in large amounts increases blood pressure, but coffee and tea or natural sources at moderate intakes typically don't have an impact on blood pressure. So when we kind of summarize all the data, back in 2015, the dietary guidelines of the US, the committee got together and decided, well, it's time to take a look at caffeine and coffee in general in our population. And they kind of pulled together all the data. And for the first time in 2015, they had this kind of guideline suggesting that up to 5 cups of coffee per day is safe and potentially beneficial. So that was coffee. But as we know, 5 cups of coffee per day is quite a bit. And it can, if a cup of coffee contains maybe, a kind of a diluted coffee might have maybe 100 milligrams of caffeine, that could add up to like 500 milligrams of caffeine. So that's quite a bit. So just to kind of reiterate that it wasn't a recommendation that we should be increasing, like everyone strive for 5 cups per day. That's a lot. It's basically, if you're already consuming that, you don't need to cut back because it's probably good for you. And so that was in 2015. And now with the 2020 guidelines, I had a pretty good scan, and I don't actually see any messages regarding coffee anymore. It's possible that 2015 was the year of coffee, but in 2020, they don't actually talk about the benefits of coffee, but they kind of reel it back and focus on caffeine again. And they suggest that children up to about 2 years of age should avoid all caffeine because there's basically no safe limits. We don't know a whole lot about the impact of caffeine on the health of our children. Pregnancy, they should limit their caffeine intake to under 300 milligrams per day. So if, a diluted coffee, that would be 3 cups. And for healthy adults, limit to around 400 milligrams per day. And that's actually based on FDA. So that's already around, 4 cups per day. So now it's a little different. We're getting kind of mixed messages a bit, right? And in 2020, coffee and tea are actually discussed in the context of calories and saying that you can substitute like your colas and sodas and fruit juices and drinks with coffee and tea instead because you don't provide any calories, being that you don't add things to them, right? Cola and energy drinks, while also containing caffeine, they're not discussed in caffeine in the context of caffeine, but rather discussed in the context of sugar. So there's a bit of kind of a mixed messages here, and the priorities, at least in 2020, seem to be more of the calorie intake. And FDA in just August of this year released a pretty impactful statement indicating that caffeine can be part of a healthy diet, but too much can be aversive. And this really relates to the acute effects of caffeine. If you're drinking too much caffeine, it can lead to increased heart rate, potential heart palpitation if you're sensitive to it, blood pressure, sleep problems, and a number of other symptoms. So that's with too much. And they also, again, as mentioned with the dietary guidelines, 400 milligrams is typically safe, but some people are sensitive to it, and too much can vary between individuals. And that's really been the kind of the basis of some of the work that I've been focusing on. And in terms of labeling, they also caution people that packaged foods and beverages must list caffeine in the ingredients list only when it's a standalone ingredient. So they've added caffeine to it. Your typical bag of coffee grinds, it's not going to have caffeine in the ingredients list because it's natural, right? It's just coffee. So we don't know how much caffeine it contains. But things that contain, or even things that contain chocolate or coffee as an ingredient, they'll have coffee and chocolate. Chocolate is also another source of caffeine, but a very small source. That would be in the ingredient list, but it wouldn't be necessarily caffeine because it's natural. And also importantly, labeling the quantity of caffeine is actually voluntary. Again, these are US guidelines. And finally, by law, food companies are responsible for making sure any use of caffeine in their products is safe. Some of you might be aware of some of the issues that came up in the past years. Most recently, this year in May, where Panera had this, what they call charged lemonade drinks. And there are actually 4 lawsuits, 2 of which resulted in deaths. And those are actually ongoing. And basically their lemonade had a pretty good punch of caffeine. I think if one typical serving contained as much as 350 milligrams of caffeine. It's quite a bit, obviously. And so they've since then have discontinued that product. I don't know if anyone even had a drink of this, but let me know. We can talk about it afterwards. It'll be interesting to see how you felt about it. In 2010, this was a big issue with the caffeinated alcoholic drinks. And FDA actually approached 4 companies indicating, hey, this isn't right, and we can actually follow up on a lawsuit. And they voluntarily pulled their products from the market. And there's always been concerns about mixing the two, because obviously people can come up with their own mixture. They can go out and have a Red Bull with their alcohol, and that's what the people do. But that's something that we can't regulate. So that's the current status on health and the US guidelines. So I'd like just to talk a little bit more about some of the challenges and limitations, because most of the data that we have on caffeine health are based on epidemiological data. So I just like to indicate some of the key limitations of this work. That is, individuals who are familiar with epidemiology, there are classic limitations like reverse causation and confounding. That's also applicable to nutrition epidemiology. But what's unique about dietary caffeine is that the dietary source of caffeine can vary, as already mentioned. And because we don't know how much caffeine some of these products contain, it's variable, even within sources. You can go, even when you go to say your Starbucks one day and have a cup of coffee, in the afternoon, you have the same cup of coffee, it could contain a different amount of caffeine. It's just so variable, and particularly how you brew it. And obviously the sizes can vary. And again, here, just as an example, indicating whether it's diluted or very dark, you're hardcore or just keeping it light. And there's also individual biological variation, or their biological variation. And by that, I mean the response to caffeine and how we metabolize it. I'll be focusing more on that in subsequent slides. And finally, epidemiological studies are just associations. They don't provide any insight into causality or mechanisms. So a little bit of pharmacology. We know that after consuming caffeine, it's completely absorbed by the stomach and small intestine, and is absorbed by the body in around 45 minutes. That's generally for everybody. Blood levels peak after around 15 minutes to 2 hours. So it takes that amount of time for it to enter the system, and then we have that peak in our system. And it's distributed throughout the body and the brain. So that's why there's been concern about children and young kids. If it crosses the blood-brain barrier, what's it doing to the brain? We don't know how. That's a topic of a different talk. And caffeine metabolism, it's probably the one most well-searched searched drugs. It is a drug, one of the most widely searched drugs in the field. So we know quite a bit about its metabolism. Here we have caffeine, and the half-life ranges between 2 and 12 hours. That's between person variability. So, so one person can metabolize it. The half-life might be like 2 hours. For another individual, it might be 12 hours. And so here's a pathway for metabolism. And the key enzyme that drives the variability in caffeine metabolism is this one particular enzyme, cytochrome P450-1A2. The variability in that enzyme is what drives variability in caffeine metabolism. And there are a number of environmental factors that impact the activity of that enzyme. Known ones are smoking and heavy coffee intake. And so smoking actually increases caffeine metabolism. And so often you see that correlation of smokers and caffeine. Well, not only is it just kind of a habit, you like to see the two together, it's a biological correlation as well. But these individuals are consuming coffee, but if they're smoking as well, they're metabolizing so much more. That's why in epidemiology, we always see smokers always consuming more caffeine, biologically and also behavioral. Heavy coffee intake also induces the activity of this enzyme as well. So if you're drinking a lot of caffeine over time, it also induces its own metabolism. Factors that contribute to that alter or impair the enzyme activity are pregnancy, oral contraceptive use, estrogens, and liver disease. And because of these particular oral contraceptives and estrogens, we consistently see that women, biological women, tend to have a lower caffeine metabolism. So these are some of the key factors. And liver disease as well, because liver is where the majority of caffeine is metabolized. So if you have a dysfunctional liver, then your ability to metabolize it is impaired as well. In addition to these environmental factors, there are also genetic factors, and I'll be discussing those later. These are the physiological or short-term effects of caffeine in the body. There are numerous ones. Many of us are well aware of the effect that caffeine has on our alertness and wakeness. It also impacts our breathing. That's kind of a possible mediator in terms of endurance in sports. It might actually improve your ability to breathe much more efficiently. Also has a number of impacts on the heart and skeletal muscle and fat oxidation that could contribute to the weight management component of caffeine. As I mentioned already, at high doses increases blood pressure, and it kind of this reduction in heart rate is a bit of a rebound due to the reflexes due to the blood pressure, and also increases gastric acid secretion. I also point out specifically with coffee also increases intestinal mobility. Some individuals are well aware of this effect. I don't know what it is, but there are these people that consistently report that they have a bowel movement after they have the coffee. I know a friend of mine says, it never fails. In the morning, when he has coffee, right after coffee, he goes. But for some individuals, they don't experience this. So probably this will be a whole new world to them. But for some people, it's automatic. And that could be primarily due to the interaction between coffee and even the big dose of polyphenols it has with the microbiome. And microbiome is a kind of a hot topic these days. And the thing about coffee is that these polyphenols are actually metabolized by the gut microbiota. And so we have these different metabolites. It's just a different impact on the microbiome. So coffee has been pretty powerful in that way. These physiological responses are due primarily to the ability of caffeine to block the actions of adenosine at the adenosine receptors. And by blocking these receptors, it contributes to most of these short or acute effects. And while currently we don't know of any environmental factors that contribute to the different expression of these adenosine receptors, which can be found in the brain and throughout the body, but there could be genetic factors. So getting more into the mechanisms, in the past maybe decade or so, there's been a great increase in or advancements in some of the technology that allows us to really delve deeper into our epidemiological studies. And these are kind of the different omics. And these are basically collective technologies that are used to explore the roles and relationships and actions of various types of molecules that make up the cells and organisms. They're high throughput, they provide a global view, and instead of hypothesis testing, so looking at individual genes or compounds and risk, we now have an ability to kind of capture everything in our biological systems potentially contributing to hypothesis generation. And so with these kind of unique tools, we have an opportunity to go from our typical black box epidemiology, where it's just, exposure and health disease. But by integrating these omic technologies, we can break up this box, break up this box into the different systems, looking at genetics, epigenetics, gene expression, proteome, metabolome, and the microbiome. And applying these technologies can provide some more insight into mechanisms, and also for the first time account for potential individual variation, because these systems kind of vary between individuals. And by that, with these insight into mechanisms, we can better inform our nutritional guidelines, provide potential novel preventive strategies that can be ultimately returned with personalized nutrition. So that's the hope. But how it's been panning out, obviously, this technology is kind of ramping up. So slowly it's been integrating into a lot of our research. And so I've had an opportunity to apply these concepts to the role that coffee and caffeine play in heart disease. And I spend a lot of time on the genetics, so I'll focus on that predominantly for the rest. In 2004, the human genome was sequenced, and this allowed our ability to kind of conduct what we call these genome-wide association studies. These are very common now. It allows you to basically genetically profile every individual and then look at every single variant within each gene and how it relates to disease outcomes. So I had an interest in applying this to caffeine-related traits. And since 2010, I've been involved in a number of genome-wide association studies that have looked at self-reported coffee and caffeine drinking behavior. So basically asking submitting kind of these questionnaires, what we call food frequency questionnaires, where we ask how much coffee or caffeine these people consume. So thousands of individuals, and the studies are kind of a meta-analysis of a number of cohorts around the world. And we ask them how much they're consuming, and then we have all their genetic data, and then we look at these associations. Now, when I initially embarked on this in 2010, everyone thought this is not going to work, because these diet questionnaires and capturing how much caffeine people are drinking, it's probably not very accurate. But interestingly, we found very strong signals. And while I will be going into every study, I will be kind of summarizing what we found. So here I have a chart just showing you not the specific genetic variants, but the genes in which the genetic variants are found. And they are ranked in the order of strongest effect. So here we have, this one is CYP22. If you recall, it was responsible for around 95% of caffeine metabolism, and the variability in that gene does contribute to caffeine metabolism. And we find that it is related to not only caffeine and coffee self-reported intake, but also circulating levels of caffeine metabolites. So there's one study where we had actual blood levels of caffeine in the blood, and so we also conducted a GWAS of that. And so we found basically the same variants. So CYP1A2 is one, but obviously there are a number of others here as well. And what we found is that the top hits were all genes related to the metabolism of caffeine. So genetic variation in metabolism of caffeine was not only impacting people's behavior and their caffeine or coffee-seeking behaviors, but also the circulating levels in the blood. There were other ones that related to the response. So the adenosine 2A receptors, and that was one that I thought would have been key, because it's the kind of responsive, and people have those short-term effects of caffeine. But those were, while they appeared, they weren't as strong as our metabolism genes. So it kind of provides a little bit more insight into what's driving the genetic factors related to these. And it's also important to note that the frequencies, these are rare variants, they're pretty common in the population. And it's also important to note that the frequencies of these vary by ancestry. And that's kind of important because there are clear race differences in caffeine consumption. One consistent finding is that Blacks continuously consume lower amounts of caffeine, coffee in particular. They like their fruit juices and sweets. And it's consistent. It's like in in a lot of studies. And so there might not only be perhaps some cultural or other factors that play a role in that disparity, but it could be genetics as well, because they might have just different frequencies. I haven't followed up on that, but it's potential for that. Now if we look at the directions of these effects, and this is also important to note. Here we have the directions effects here. It shows you the red suggested that. So in this case, taking CYP1A2, the genetic variant that leads to higher levels of caffeine in the blood, that same variant leads to lower caffeine consumption. So this would suggest that for these individuals that have that particular variant, it's possible that it impairs the activity of this enzyme. So caffeine levels increase in the blood. And with that, individuals respond to caffeine. It's like, okay, wow, that's a lot of caffeine in my blood. I will naturally reduce my intake. And that's what we're showing here. Even these others from pharmacology, other ones related to metabolism, all suggesting that these variants that impair caffeine metabolism, caffeine is higher in the blood, so these individuals naturally respond by cutting back. So in essence, the other variants that I didn't talk about are kind of pleiotropic, so we really can't interpret them. Pleiotropic meaning that not only are they related to these caffeine traits, but they're also related to other diseases and lipids. So they're probably not specific, but what's specific are the pharmacology ones, which are really interesting. And so going back to the impact that they have on the metabolites in the blood and also the behavior. So basically what we're seeing is that at a population level, these genetics are kind of acting as a way to help us titrate our levels to match the responses. So people will consume, if they're feeling good, it's like, okay, that's as much caffeine as I need. It could be your genetics. Obviously, many of us are well aware of the impact of caffeine on our systems. It's not solely genetics. These variants explain a very small amount of the variation, but they do contribute to it. Naturally, most of people kind of have learned, because caffeine is so widely available, everyone has really had the opportunity to experience it and test it for themselves. So they kind of know their boundaries. And while this is shown in a kind of a genetic kind of population level, this kind of natural titration has actually been shown many years back. And this is 1986 kind of a small trial where they had in an office setting where they manipulated the amount of caffeine in the coffee pot. And they found that as they lowered the amount of the caffeine concentration in the coffee, people tended to come to the coffee room more and consume more coffee. So it was naturally people are like, okay, wow, I'm not feeling it. I got to get more coffee. People just naturally kind of titrated their levels, which is, it's kind of scary because it's obviously caffeine is a drug, and there's concerns about that. And here again, I'll walk you through kind of example of what we're seeing. Again, taking CYP1A2 for example, because we inherit two alleles, there's two copies of these variants, and so there's a possibility of 3 different genotypes. And so in this case, if we hold, take coffee, for example, take the amount of coffee steady. If we have 3 individuals with 3 different genotypes corresponding to a genotype corresponding to rapid metabolism, intermediate, and slow metabolism. If they come in, say, to a lab, we ask them to consume a cup of coffee, regular coffee. For one individual has the genotype corresponding to rapid metabolism, they will metabolize caffeine very quickly. And here I have kind of the levels indicating the response to caffeine. So let's just say our sweet spot is right about here. So if we take individuals who metabolize the caffeine quickly, the amount of time it's going to be in that zone is minimal. So it's after 1 cup of coffee, they got their peak, and then all of a sudden, like maybe half an hour later, it's gone. And then you have another, or on the other extreme, individuals who have a gene corresponding to slow metabolism. Caffeine circulates in the blood longer, and so they experience the response to caffeine much longer. Now, this is holding coffee or caffeine intake steady, but because humans are just difficult or just different, well, this is the actual drinking behavior. Given that these individuals are metabolizing caffeine quickly, they naturally just consume more in order to maintain caffeine at those levels that correspond to just the right spot. And we see that also with the extreme group. So these individuals just cut back. And now I used coffee as an example because, well, caffeine is a component that's kind of driving these relationships. Coffee also contains polyphenols and other compounds, which aren't metabolized at the same rate as caffeine. So it's interesting that this individual, over time, they'll metabolize caffeine quickly and it'll be excreted from the system, but their body is going to be so impacted by the other polyphenols that are in coffee. So they might actually benefit most from coffee consumption because they're metabolizing potentially maybe the adverse effects of caffeine over time and reaping the benefits of the polyphenols that are found in coffee. So that has some implications for coffee and health overall. But again, because humans are just challenging to study, I've also conducted a number of other studies looking at the role of these variants and how they play in how we prepare coffee and other dietary factors. And we find that individuals who have these genes that correspond to rapid caffeine metabolism, they tend to consume their coffee black more compared to individuals who are slow metabolism. They also like dark chocolate. Dark chocolate contains caffeine, but dark chocolate in particular versus milk has more caffeine. That's just kind of scary because these people are seeking out caffeine. And caffeine is naturally bitter. In coffee, humans naturally avoid bitter substances. And so why are we drinking coffee? But because of the impact that caffeine in the coffee that the beneficial or the alerting effect that it has, it's almost like a learned effect. So you coin that stimulated effect with the bitterness of caffeine. And so it's kind of a learned behavior. And that might be driving what we see with our rapid caffeine metabolizers. On the extreme end, individuals who are not consuming a whole lot of coffee because of their genetics, when they do consume coffee, they tend to add their milk and their sweeteners to it. And interestingly, they instead of drinking coffee, they like their other sweet beverages. We see this kind of inverse relationship. Going back also to our rapid caffeine metabolizers, in the epidemiological studies, we show that these individuals also consume more decaf. Thing is, what in this population, it's likely that decaf is a marker of former heavy coffee consumption. So these people are probably people that used to be heavy coffee consumers, but are now drinking a decaf. These are kind of the nuances of the epidemiological studies. So that's important to note. So while these genetic factors contribute to differences in overall quantity of dietary caffeine intake, the types of caffeine that they seek out are quite different. So if you think about that and add this data, say, into a population study, these are things you need to consider. So our heavy coffee drinkers, if it's primarily due to genetics, they're just very different. So how else can we use these genetic findings? Obviously, the food drug manufacturing and marketing could probably think of very novel ways to potentially derive products that are genotype specific. We're not at that level yet, but possibly in the future. I've had a special interest in the risk assessment and also biological mechanistic insights, which I'll be going into a little bit more. But in terms of health impact, there's always been this controversy. I think up to this point, you're probably thinking that, this is for real, this potential that people can be addictive because it's so widely available. But there's always been controversies whether caffeine is a potential drug of dependence. Now, our DSM and even the World Health Organization do not consider caffeine addictive. I've talked to colleagues in the UK, and apparently their country does suggest that caffeine is addictive. In the latest DSM 5th edition, they only discuss caffeine in the context of caffeine-related disorders and caffeine withdrawal in particular, but they don't consider caffeine a drug of abuse or a substance to worry about. There are camps in the research world say that no, it's definitely addictive. It's got the withdrawal symptoms. There's clearly and if you talk to someone on the street and ask them if they're addicted, some people will say, "Yeah, I'm addicted. I can't go a day without a bed." These are like surveys that have shown this as well. So some people will argue. Obviously, to say that caffeine is addictive, it kind of trivializes real addictions, which is probably why they don't want to have caffeine in there. Because first of all, we're at a point in our life where we can't regulate anymore. We've got coffee shops on every corner. And to say that caffeine is addictive is now a drug. Okay, what are we gonna have to do? Like start IDing people before they come into a coffee shop? That's gonna be kind of difficult to do. I've had a special interest in looking at looking at the kind of a gene, coffee and caffeine interaction and health outcomes. It actually began back in 2006. It's actually before these genome-wide association studies were conducted. So perhaps my supervisor was a little ahead of his time, but we conducted these analyses looking at, not surprisingly, we looked at CYP1 and 2 because we thought it was an obvious low-hanging fruit. There's got to be variance in there. And so I actually have done some studies, and we found as part of my PhD thesis, we found that individuals with a genotype corresponding to rapid caffeine metabolism, there was no increased risk of heart disease with coffee consumption. But people with impaired caffeine metabolism, based on their genetics, we found that there was an increased risk. And so that was one of the very first kind of strong gene coffee interactions that were published back in the day in JAMA. Since then, there hasn't been a whole lot. Interestingly, my particular report has often been linked to some of the 23andMe results. I don't know if some of you are involved in this, but these direct-to-consumer genotyping companies are quite prevalent now. And when they were first launched, they actually had the variant for CYP1 and 2. And when they provided kind of insight to individuals based on their genetics, they say that, oh, you have this variant, this is what it means. So they often cited this work. Following up on, again, gene diet interactions, I've applied this concept to a number of other outcomes. In most cases, we find associations, but they don't vary by genetic variation, suggesting that although these variants contribute only to kind of a very small variability in caffeine metabolism, overall might suggest that coffee or caffeine are predominantly beneficial in all these examples predominantly. Mendelian randomization, I'll just briefly touch on this because you see a lot of these in the research these days. It's basically using genetic variants as a proxy for the risk factor and doing what we call, again, Mendelian randomizations, because what's useful about these Mendelian randomizations is that they have these assumptions. They assume that this genetic variant kind of acts as a proxy for this risk factor, but the variant does not relate to the outcome and does not associate with the confounders. Because as I mentioned, confounders are key in the epidemiological studies. And so instead of actually asking people how much they consume, if you use the variant, so we have this variant that assume that it's linked to caffeine behavior, if we just use that, because genetics, that doesn't change anymore. Our DNA is stat. It's not going to change. So we can use that as kind of a marker of our lifetime exposure to caffeine. So if we assume this variant, these individuals are consuming caffeine, let's just see if this variant relates to these outcomes. So that's what the concept of Mendelian randomization is. And again, it tries to parallel what we see in a randomized trial. Now, randomized controlled trials are gold standards in nutrition, but when obviously for health outcomes, they're not feasible to do. And so again, a standard randomized controlled trial would have a group of people consuming caffeine, have another group that does not consume caffeine. And they, with the control, they assume that these confounders are all equal between groups. And then they follow these individuals over time and look for differences. Classic randomization design. So with Mendelian randomization, they take a full population and they actually randomize individuals based on their genotype. And with that, there are, again, assumptions. They assume that looking at the variance, that the confounders between these groups are held steady and they're kind of controlled for. And then following them over time, we can use these kind of a very efficient way to conduct, say, get some causal insight. But if you recall, I've already talked about potential confounders, because although these individuals vary by that one particular genetic variant, I already mentioned that there's other things going on. These people that are fast metabolizers are drinking coffee very differently in different ways. So this actually violates some of the assumptions. And it's important to note this because there have been a lot of Mendelian randomization studies using the variants that we've identified. And you need to really understand or interpret the results, because some of them find causal relationships and what does that mean? Is it going to be black coffee? Is it caffeine? So you just need to be really critical of that, because they do violate the assumptions for these Mendelian randomization studies. In addition to genetics, I've also looked at the metabolome, and briefly, I actually collaborated with a group that had already conducted this randomized control trial where in Finland, they had these individuals consume for 1 month, abstain from coffee, then for another month, consume 4 cups per day, and then for another month, 8 cups per day. It wasn't a randomized control trial, but it was kind of like increasing your intake. 8 cups per day might be freaking people out, but in Finland, it's very common. They drink a lot of coffee, so it wasn't a big deal. And so with this coffee trial, they had available blood samples stored. And so again, I'm not talking about genetics, but I'm talking about metabolites. So what I did is apply this metabolomic technologies, and I was able to take their plasma and profile it for about 733 metabolites. And then we obviously did some statistical analysis, and what we found is that over 100 metabolites correlated with increasing coffee consumption. And while I won't go through all 113, these kind of fell on around 33 different pathways. The major pathway was the xanthine metabolism. So within xanthine metabolisms, those are all the caffeine metabolites. Those all increased. So that's kind of a positive control factor. So what we were seeing was right. But some other pathways were especially interesting. One particular pathway that was novel and had never been linked to coffee was the endocannabinoid pathway. Here we found that in the trial at 4 and 8 cups per day, the endocannabinoid levels increased. That's interesting. Endocannabinoids are what they're kind of the homogeneous cannabinoids, or they're produced by the body. Interestingly, they interact with the same receptors that cannabis interacts with. So the CB1 receptor. And interacting with or activating these receptors have a number of physiological effects. One example being on appetite and even insulin metabolism. And so what we found with coffee that it decreased these levels. So with decreasing the endocannabinoid levels, the activation of these receptors are much lower. And so it probably counteracts, or what we see is probably the opposite of these. So instead of, with cannabis, when you smoke cannabis, you get the munchies. Here with the endocannabinoids, when they go down, perhaps one way in which coffee helps or caffeine helps with weight management might be an appetite, because it would counter this impact on food intake. Could be different. This is the first time it's ever been linked to coffee consumption. So I thought it was really kind of novel and something new that we would like to explore in the future. I've also conducted a proteomic analysis where we actually measured proteins using the same trial. We found 2 major hits, carboxypeptidase M and neutral ceramidase. These all have functions, but how it links to coffee consumption or behavior is unknown. But again, these are hypothesis generating technologies. So these are providing potentially new insights into the way that coffee might play in health, and something that we could follow up on and gain mechanistic insight to coffee and caffeine in health. Now, the next and final component is the microbiome. I haven't done research on this, but there's great interest in it. And just to kind of highlight the impact that coffee does have on the microbiome, taking this paper in Science many years ago, it was a population-based study where they took kind of a cohort study based on their diet intakes, based on their self-reported intakes. Of all the foods that they looked at and the microbiome, they found that obviously the carbohydrates is key because it's kind of related to the microbiome, but coffee was among the top hits for impacting or causing changes in the microbiome or correlated with the microbiome. Coffee was related to the kind of increased microbiome diversity. And again, it comes back to the polyphenol content. It interacts with the gut, the microbiota there, metabolize it, and kind of alters the microbiome overall. And what's interesting is that of all the top hits, beer, fruits, all of these are kind of are things that do interact with the microbiome. But what's cool about coffee is that although taking coffee as its own, it's naturally caffeine free or energy free. So for it to have such a strong impact on the microbiome is pretty astonishing, especially when soda with sugar is just right above it, and it basically has the opposite effect. That soda also contains caffeine. So really, again, kind of highlighting the differences between the different beverages. So in summary, although we can't walk away and say, oh, wait, great, caffeine is our friend. It really comes down to individual variation. So for healthy adults, so people who don't have chronic disease, coffee and perhaps tea can be part of a healthy diet. The FDA also suggests that caffeine up to 400 milligrams per day, about 4 cups of coffee, for example, a lot more soda. So I wouldn't recommend getting your 400 milligrams, or you're trying to get your 400 milligrams of soda because you're getting sugar as well. That would be 400 milligrams would be safe. And again, individuals vary, and I just provided pretty good evidence to suggest there's variability. Even without the genetics, I think all of us kind of know that we know that one person that is drinking 8 cups of coffee per day, and they're like that's sick. I won't be able to sleep. Another person clearly is drinking 1. So we kind of naturally know because it's a drug. We learn over time, right? Especially with adults. Future, I haven't talked at all about children and adolescents. And what's concerning is that these energy drinks and sodas, they're major source of caffeine in that particular group, and they're targeting that group. That's why the increase in energy intake among young adolescents is a concern, because not only is it caffeine, it's sugar. And because it's not a hot beverage, you can down these things within 5 minutes and go. That's where we had those acute cases where potential for death, right? You can see them a whole bunch. Getting, say a gram of caffeine, which is toxic, getting a gram of caffeine in 10 cups of coffee, it would take you quite a long time. You likely be full of liquid before you even maxed out on that. So very different. And finally, I hope I provide you some promising insight to some of this advanced technology and how we can actually learn a little bit more about exactly what it is about these dietary sources of coffee and what they're doing to health. And with that, I'd like to just finalize, just acknowledge all the people that contributed to more of the genetic work, but also my mentors and very close collaborators that have really contributed to much of my work over time.